Is that a theatrical red curtain behind you, Fran? Are you about to...
This is Kidder's. It's Kidder's room.
We have
there's Paul.
Paul, nice to meet you, mate. Thanks for coming.
Oh. We've got...
It's good to be here. It's good to be anywhere.
Yeah. It surely is. We're going to get started in a minute, I think, guys. If there's no one else in the waiting room, Jack, I don't think so.
No, and I'll catch them as they come in. So.
Okay. Well, I can waffle on anyway, so there's... Before we actually get to the good stuff, there's quite a lot of me just talking, mainly for the benefit of our audience and posterity rather than our audience here who kind of know who we are and what we do already. But, so just bear with me, everyone, while I rant and dribble on like a complete lunatic. And then we'll get to the good stuff and we can actually have Kevin's poems, which will be amazing. Okay, so we've got Julie as well. Oh, great, there we go. Okay, I'm going to start. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the triumphant return of Culture Matters online digital reading series. With a special Halloween edition, we are proud to launch the first in our new series of digital poetry pamphlets, Deleted Scenes, Poems and Memory of Shirley Jackson by the mighty Kevin Patrick McCann. And we're launching tonight with a reading and a short author Q&A. Deleted Scenes is this unsettling poetic riff on the 1963 film The Haunting, and of course the book on which it is based, The Haunting of Hill House by the immortal Shirley Jackson. These poems traffic in the uncanny and the unsaid, merging moments from across the house's long and morbid history into a single though unstable present. Just as Jackson's novel is a story of frustrated passions and repressed pain, McCann's poems also deal in the missing, the buried, and the deliberately obscured. So if you turn your attention towards the chat, I should, God willing, be able to post a link to the book. Yeah, there we go. Boom. And you can download the book. It is free, but we would ask that if the spirit moves you, consider making a donation to fund our ongoing cultural struggle for a fair society. And for those of you who don't know, which I don't think is anyone in the room, but for our audience out there in posterity and languishing in the ether, Culture Matters are a cooperative of writers, artists, and activists. We maintain a lively website publishing criticism, commentary, fiction, poetry, and life writing. We run the always free Bread and Roses Arts Award for Poetry, Songwriting, and Spoken Word, and we support the labour movement through workshops and campaigns around cultural issues. We also publish various books and pamphlets. Through our publishing operations, we aim to offer a platform to a genuinely diverse array of writers and artists from all walks of life, with a particular emphasis on working class creatives who are so often marginalised within mainstream contemporary publishing. Before I begin, I would like to thank the team that brought Deleted Scenes together: Mike Quill, our stalwart showrunner and editor-in-chief. Way, our dilettante typesetter, Alan Morrison, our resident artist and designer, Jack Varnell, you can applaud yourself now as well, who is also running the Zoom room and providing tech support. And of course, the wonderful Kevin McCann for his poems, which are just fantastic. So Kevin had made the mistake of asking me to provide a little poetic warm-up for this evening. And I thought it would be better, and not just because literally anything would, were I to share not my own words, but those of Shirley Jackson, by reading from the opening of The Haunting of Hill House, and setting the scene a little and introducing one of the pivotal figures in the story and in the poems. So if you bear with me, I'm going to go and get into character as Shirley Jackson. You have to imagine me as Shirley Jackson, which is not that big of a stretch, but I'm going to try and do something about my accent, which is not very New England, is it really? Okay, so watch amazing transformation happening. Method acting now. Chapter 1. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House. and whatever walked there walked alone. Dr. John Montague was a doctor of philosophy. He had taken his degree in anthropology, feeling obscurely that in this field he might come closest to his true vocation, the analysis of supernatural manifestations. He was scrupulous about the use of his title because his investigations being so utterly unscientific, he hoped to borrow an air of respectability, even scholarly authority from his education. It had cost him a good deal in money and pride, since he was not a begging man, to rent Hill House for 3 months. But he expected absolutely to be compensated for his pains by the sensation following upon the publication of his definitive work on the causes and effects of psychic disturbances in a house commonly known as haunted. He had been looking for an honestly haunted house all his life. When he heard of Hill House, he had at first been doubtful, then hopeful, then indefatigable. He was not the man to let go of Hill House once he had found it. Dr. Montague's intentions with regard to Hill House derived from the methods of the intrepid 19th century ghost hunters. He was going to go and live in Hill House and see what happened there. It was his intention at first to follow the example of the anonymous lady who went to stay at Balachen House and run a summer-long house party for skeptics and believers, with croquet and ghost watching as the outstanding attractions. But skeptics, believers, and good croquet players are harder to come by today. Dr. Montague was forced to engage assistants. Perhaps the leisurely ways of Victorian life lent themselves more agreeably to the devices of psychic investigation. Or perhaps the painstaking documentation of phenomena has largely gone out as a means of determining actuality. At any rate, Dr. Montague had not only to engage assistants, but to search for them. Because he thought of himself as careful and conscientious, he spent considerable time looking for his assistants. He combed through the records of the psychic societies, the back files of sensational newspapers, the reports of parapsychologists, and assembled a list of names of people who had, in one way or another, at one time or another, no matter how briefly or dubiously, been involved in abnormal events. From his list, he first eliminated the names of people who were dead. When he had crossed them off, he then went to those who seemed to him publicity seekers, of subnormal intelligence, or unsuitable because of a clear tendency to take center stage. After eliminating these, he had a list of perhaps a dozen names. Each of these people then received a letter from Dr. Montague, extending an invitation to spend all or part of a summer at a comfortable country house, old but perfectly equipped with plumbing, electricity, central heating, and clean mattresses. The purpose of their stay, the letters stated clearly, was to observe and explore the various unsavory stories which had been circulated about the house for most of its 80 years of existence. Dr. Montague's letters did not say openly that Hill House was haunted, because Dr. Montague was a man of science, and until he had actually experienced a psychic manifestation in Hill House, he would not trust his luck too far. Consequently, his letters had a certain ambiguous dignity calculated to catch at the imagination of a very special sort of reader. To his dozen letters, Dr. Montague had 4 replies, the other 8 or so candidates having presumably moved and left no forwarding address, or possibly having lost interest in the supernormal, or even perhaps never having existed at all. To the 4 who replied, Dr. Montague wrote again, naming a specific day when the house would be officially regarded as ready for occupancy, and enclosing detailed directions for reaching it, since, as he was forced to explain, information about finding the house was extremely difficult to get, particularly from the rural community which surrounded it. On the day before he was to leave for Hill House, Dr. Montague was persuaded to take into the select company a representative of the family who owned the house, and a telegram arrived from one of his candidates backing out with a clearly manufactured excuse. Another never came or wrote, perhaps because of some pressing personal problem which had intervened. The other 2 came. Eleanor Vance was 32 years old when she came to Hill House. The only person in the world she genuinely hated, now that her mother was dead, was her sister. She disliked her brother-in-law and her 5-year-old niece, and she had no friends. This was owing largely to the 11 years she had spent caring for her invalid mother, which had left her with some proficiency as a nurse and an ability to face strong sunlight without blinking. She could not remember ever being truly happy in her adult life. Her years with her mother had been built up devotedly around small guilts and small reproaches, constant weariness and unending despair. Without ever wanting to become reserved or shy, she'd spent so long alone and with no one to love that it was difficult for her to talk, even casually, to another person without self-consciousness and an awkward inability to find words. Her name had turned up on Dr. Montague's list because one day, when she was 12 years old and her sister was 18, and their father had been dead for not quite a month, showers of stones had fallen on their house without any warning or indication of purpose or reason, dropping from the ceiling, rolling loudly down the walls, breaking windows, and pattering maddeningly onto the roof. The stones continued intermittently for 3 days, during which time Eleanor and her sister were less unnerved by the stones than by the neighbors and sightseers who gathered daily outside the front door, and by their mother's blind, hysterical insistence that all of this was due to malicious, backbiting people on the block who had it in for her ever since she came. After 3 days, Eleanor and her sister were removed to the house of a friend and the stones stopped falling. Nor did they ever return, although Eleanor and her sister and her mother went back to living in the house, and the feud with the entire neighborhood was never ended. The story had been forgotten by everyone except the people Dr. Montague consulted. It had certainly been forgotten by Eleanor and her sister, each of whom had supposed at the time that the other was responsible. During the whole underside of her life, ever since her first memory, Eleanor had been waiting for something like Hill House, caring for her mother, lifting a cross old lady from her chair to her bed, sending out endless little trays of soup and oatmeal, steeling herself to the filthy laundry. Eleanor had held fast to the belief that someday something would happen. She had accepted the invitation to Hill House by return mail, although her brother-in-law had insisted upon calling a couple of people to make sure that this doctor fellow was not aiming to introduce Eleanor to savage rites, not unconnected with matters Eleanor's sister deemed it improper for an unmarried young woman to know. Perhaps, Eleanor's sister whispered in the privacy of the marital bedroom, perhaps Dr. Montague, if that really was his name after all, perhaps this Dr. Montague used these women for some, well, experiments, experiments the way they do. Eleanor's sister dwelt richly upon experiments she had heard these doctors did. Eleanor had no such ideas, or having them was not afraid. Eleanor, in short, would have gone anywhere. Okay. The transformation back now. There you go. Hi, that's me. Jack will have to say, as our only representative from the United States, no, and Paul as well, they have to say that, that accent. How was that? Was that dreadful or?
Oh, great, Fran.
Or kind of like middlingly dreadful? Your silence says it all.
Let's just
but I
say,
thought anyway that was a good way of kind of
Shirley
like
Jackson's voice, and it's the thought that counts.
I did exactly right, precisely. Yes, I'd like to see Shirley Jackson do a sort of like Anglo-Irish accent. I'd like to hear that. She couldn't do that. So. Okay. So having set the tone and then promptly ruining it, I'm now going to hand over to Kevin. Kevin Patrick McCann has published 8 collections of poetry for adults, and I think that there's a new one on the way as well, which is very exciting, and I hope he might tell us about it a wee bit later. He's published 1 collection of poetry for children as well, Diary of a Shapeshifter, Earthers Productions. There is also a book of ghost stories, It's Gone Dark, by Other Side Books, and Teach Yourself Publishing from Hodder, co-written with the playwright Tom Green. Of is a fantasy novel for children. So Kevin wears many hats. He's a real polymath. And he is a regular and valued contributor to Culture Matters and to the Communist Review as well. He's a good comrade, a great person, and a cracking poet. So please join me in welcoming Kevin Patrick McCann.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, you muted me, Fran. That was it. Okay, first poem. Now this one, this is like a prologue, and in the film, which these poems were largely inspired by, but the book came into it as well. In the film, Hugh Crane builds this house in 1880 something. I can't remember the exact year, but Victorian times anyway. His first wife dies just as she's about to see the house. She's in a buggy that crashes, and she's carried, in the words of Dr. Marquay, as he's called in the film, carried lifeless into the house. And he later remarries, and his second wife dies mysteriously. She falls down a flight of stairs. Nobody knows how it happened. It's assumed she was pushed by a ghost or something. And he's got a daughter, Abigail. And this is about one possible explanation as to Mrs. Crane's untimely and apparently mysterious death. It's called As the Second Mrs. Crane. As the second Mrs. Crane bustles, smiling, one hand on her swollen belly in what had been her nursery, Abigail crouches inside a shadow. As the second Mrs. Crane steps out sensibly onto the landing, nursery door slams shut behind her. She half turns, her heel a lifting reflex that doesn't quite clear piano wire, taut, invisible, ankle height. Glimpses Abigail wave, hears laughter, feels her lungs emptying as Abigail, wire snipped, runs down backstairs, balled in her palm, out into the garden, cold dew between her toes that tickles. She turns and turns, someone is screaming, and turns again until the grass falls up to meet her, arms crossed, fingertips splayed at each shoulder. The world's a dime spinning slowly on its edge, slowly wobbling until it clatters down heads. Now, the next poem I'm going to read you, I'm just going to have to scroll down and find it. The next one is called Answered an Ad, and this is about when Eleanor receives the letter from Dr. Marquay inviting her to come and spend time at Hill House, and the journey, which her sister tries to stop her from taking. She won't. She says, you can't have the car, you're not going, because of these doctors, they do experiments, etc., etc. Really what it is, she just wants to keep her there because she's free help. So this is Answered an Ad. Pulls the apartment door towards her. It slowly clicks shut. Picks up her bag, pads downstairs, slips on her shoes, clack taps echoing the basement car park, finds her old Ford, still starts first time, drives up the ramp, checks right and left, no traffic yet, rereads the directions that came with his note, rolls down her window, grips the wheel, gulping, at long last sets off. Chalk my name on the sidewalk, watched that night as rain washed it off, reaches the freeway, still early, still quiet, but takes a highway instead, as her sister wakes up crying, makes coffee until it's late enough to foam. A shower of stones cracked our roof tiles. Mother said it was neighbours who'd never liked us. Mid-morning, she stops at a diner, drinks coffee, has donuts for breakfast, openly smokes, and as she leaves, brushing some man, beery breath, who whistles, and the wheels on the car go round and past a cop parked by some billboard, asleep, round and round and round, overtakes a school bus, jauntist, empty, round and round, reaches her turn-off, checks herself in the mirror, practices smiling. Now, the next one is called I Am the One. Now, the thing about this is, this was actually the first poem that got written. Basically, what happened was, long story, very, very short. My father, who died in 2015, he didn't have any mental problems. His memory wasn't quite what it had been, but he was still basically okay, compos mentis, a bit frail, physically frail. My mother was in the early stages of dementia. She was still recognizably herself and could still be communicated with. And my brother was looking after them. He lives in Blackpool, I live in Liverpool. And I was going over there whenever I could spare the time, which was pretty frequently. Being a poet, I wasn't exactly inundated with work, so I could get across quite often. And one evening, my mum and dad were watching something on the telly in the living room. And I said, do you mind if I go? There's telly in the front room in that house as well. So I went in the front room and put on The Haunting and started watching it. And there's one bit very early in the film where Eleanor's in her car. She goes through the gates and goes along the path. And as she reaches a turn off, she sees the house for the first time. And as I was watching the film, I actually said out loud to myself, well, if that was me looking at that place, I'd probably do a U-turn and go straight back out again. And then I remembered the guy, the fellow that didn't turn up. So I had a notebook. I always carry a notebook everywhere I go. I grabbed the notebook and wrote like the first 3 verses really quickly, then put it on one side and didn't finish it until a few days later. So that's the background to that one. I am the one. Oh, hang on. I was trying to use my hearing aid case as a mouse then. I am the one who set out that morning, instructions laid out on the passenger seat. I am the one who, after driving all day, slowed through that town. But when I wound down my window to ask last-minute directions, had my "pardon me, sir," or "excuse me there, ma'am," got no more response than some panhandling bum. I am the one who was last to arrive, so the caretaker said, then smiled at his wife. I am the one who followed that last curving stretch, and when the house pounced just past that tree stump where the first Mrs. Crane was killed, I hung in a vacuum, head in a vice, cold, freshly scalped. I am the one whose mind changed right there. I'm the one who turned back. And the next one is, I was imagining the first night in Hill House, because in both the novel and in the film, it's clear that Eleanor, when she arrives, is already starting to feel very at home very quickly. She's free. She's free from the life that she's had. And this is just the thoughts that are going through her mind. It's only quite a short one, this. It's called Their First Night. Their first night, she thought, I could fall asleep right now, or dare a drink like Daddy did, or even dare a few, and meditate on every pile of soiled linen, every slow motion walk from bedroom to bathroom and then back again. Mother's final, that'll do. Her dry goodnight kiss, that sick room smell of scented soap and ammonia, and my every guilty midnight prayer. Oh, Jesus, make it stop. Now, the next one, I'm just scrolling, got it. The next one is just called That First Morning. And in this one, I'm imagining Eleanor, the first morning, she wakes up. Now, the thing I should have mentioned before, Eleanor was a carer, and I was a carer as well for 2 years. One of the reasons why I found it difficult to get over to Blackpool is because my wife's dad, who was widowed in 2000, he was also developed dementia, and we were taking it in turns to look after him. And one of the things that you learn very quickly when you're taking care of anybody with that condition is never ever count on sleeping all night. You won't. There were occasions where I'd hear him at 2 o'clock in the morning on the landing, fully dressed, thinking it was morning, ready to go downstairs. You couldn't have a drink, not even one. Even Christmas Eve, when I was looking after him, I didn't even dare have one drink, because if I had one, he might shout me and I might not hear him. So you learn that you never relax, you can't switch off. So I was imagining Eleanor that first morning, waking up, having slept all night for the first time in probably years, and just that feeling of freedom and elation. So it's, yeah, don't say any more, Kev, read the poem. That first morning. That first morning, she slips out of bed early, pulls on her robe, slides back the drapes, dares herself to go downstairs and maybe leave a trail of breadcrumbs. Thick carpet underfoot, polished wood, the smell of beeswax, front door ajar, And once outside, cold dew between her toes that tickles, she turns and turns and turns again until the grass falls up to meet her, arms crossed, fingertips splayed at each shoulder. The whirls of dimes spinning on its edge, slows wobbling, clatters down heads up, just like Daddy, the last time she saw him, and he looked fast asleep. I should have mentioned that her father is dead. He doesn't appear in the book at all. He's obviously died quite a few years previously. You're not told in the book or the film anything about him at all. So he's another character I've often speculated about. Well, this next one, Journey's End, it carries on from where the previous one left off. Not exactly. It's Eleanor decides to go for a walk in the grounds, and it's one of the things you find out about Eleanor is that she used to write poetry. She said she had a cat called Dancer, and she loved fairy tales. And I think one of the reasons why she probably loved fairy tales, something that Tolkien pointed out in his essay on fairy tales, they always give consolation. You know, there's always the happy ending, which in real life, you know, sadly doesn't happen. So this is called Journey's End. A breeze brushes under her hand, like the back of some never-ending cat. My cat was called Dancer, then stretches ahead, flattening grass. And as Eleanor follows, bounds over a stream where the sun's turned to midnight, and Eleanor follows through the moon's filigree. This is where I could meet him, wearing the dress I've stitched secretly, and we would wander the hills until we found a hidden valley, and we'd make our bed in a hollow tree and live on acorns and wild strawberries, and I'll love my love with an E, because he is enchanted. And the last one I'll read for the moment. There are a few others, but I wasn't planning on reading the whole book. But I can come back if there's an overwhelming demand for more poems, you'll get them, don't worry. This last one, it's actually the second poem I wrote in the sequence, and it's called Dudley the Caretaker. And in the book and in the film, there's caretakers, Mr. and Mrs. Dudley. They look after the house all year round. And this is me imagining somebody's asked Dudley what happened. So he's telling his version of events. Now, I've written it using some American phonetic spelling, but I'm not going to attempt to do that because I can't do an American accent. And if it does, it sounds like I'm trying to take the piss. So I don't want to do that at all. So it's Dudley the Caretaker. So you want to hear about doors that always swing shut mysteriously, about old Mrs. Crane dying alone, and how some folks claim the house is never empty. Want to hear about coal spots, desperate messages scrawled up on walls, midnight weeping, or that crazy woman killed herself rather than leave? Well, you listen now to the only truth that is. Ain't nothing in that house except dead air and stale memories. Think me or the wife had set foot if there were. And that's me for the minute.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Everyone unmute themselves and make some love. Make some love. It makes loud noise, roof raising levels of noise. Woo,
Thank you. Thank you, comrades.
There we go. We may be small, but we are mighty. That's the truth, isn't it?
Well, can I just say one other thing I want to say as well? I'm going to embarrass Fran now, just like, I'm not too much, I'm sure, because, you know, like all poets, I'm sure she doesn't like praise. I just want to say again, thank you. Because seriously, up to this point, I've been writing poetry. I'm 68 now. And I've been writing poetry since I was about 8 or 9. So call it 60 years. And for 60 years, up until first meeting Fran and getting the support and encouragement I got off her, basically I was getting nowhere. You know, I got books published, nobody reviewed them, they didn't sell. And I think the reason why I carried on was because I think that I've got something in common with a lot of other poets and writers and artists generally. It's a compulsion, isn't it? You don't do it for the money, you don't do it for the fame and fortune, though you'd welcome both. but you do it because it seems like the right thing to do. So thank you, Fran, and thank you again for the kind reception you gave those poems. It means a lot. It really does, hell of a lot. You know, when you've had 60 years of complete silence, getting a round of applause like that's just, you know, great. Thank you.
Second that
Yeah.
emotion.
Oh yeah, we do it because we're infected with it. Yeah, I agree with you completely, Paul. Damn right, mate.
Me
Okay,
too.
Fran, over to you again.
We're all infected. Thank you. We're all infected equally, but in a nice way, not in a gross,
Yeah, I know.
disgusting, zombie, contagious way. Yeah. It's been a long day. I'm just saying words now. But yeah, I thought what we do now is we would maybe take a wee sort of 3-5 minute break so everyone can like go to the bathroom. Yes, whatever they're going to do. I'm not even going to try to imagine what you will do. The anarchy and freedom of a 5-minute break. And when we come back, we're going to have a wee Q&A with Kevin as well. So do stick around for that and chat amongst yourselves in the meantime. I'm going to go and like die of shame from my terrible Shirley Jackson accent now. Back in 5 minutes.
Rightio. I'm going to roll myself a cigarette and just pop next door and check on the cat.
Hello again, everybody. Is everybody back?
Well, I'm here.
That's well, exactly. Kevin's here, which is the most important. The most important person is here. Yeah, I'm back as well. I had to give the dog some chicken. He's like, this is the break. The question is, the Q&A is question, do you want some chicken? Answer, yes, I want some chicken. So now he's had some chicken, and I feel we're not going to have any sort of pitbull shake interruptions, because as Jack will tell you, that's a thing that happens quite a lot. He's sort of coming behind you and trying to nudge you or nudge the laptop, or just generally makes the most astonishing Hound of the Baskervilles kind of noise. Because he
one of our
attention.
cats does that. What she does when she wants sweets, she wipes her nose up and down my arm. Danielle says she's showing you affection. I said, no, she's not. She's just leaving the trailer cold cat snot up my arm. I said, like, if you don't give me some sweets, I'm just going to keep doing this until you crack, and I always do.
Yeah, that is animals for you. Why do we actually do it to ourselves? Why?
Well, it's a strange thing, isn't it, about cats? They condition you. I remember my mum telling me the cat she had. She said, I ended up, when I was going upstairs to bed with the cat, said, I had to stop every third step and tap the wall with the flat of my hand. And she said, the thing that baffles me is not just the fact that I was doing it, but how the bloody hell did she get me to do it in the first place? Which is really, really strange, you know what I mean? I've got two cats. One lives up here and one lives downstairs. They won't have anything to do with each other. They're both rescue cats. The one that lives up here, Flossie, was Danielle's dad's cat. The one who lives downstairs is like, she's got a small head, huge eyes, and an incredibly loud voice. And if she wants anything, she just goes, yeah. And it'll just be this continuous note like a siren until you've only. And you have a weird thing where you're saying to a cat, what do you want? What do you want? As if it's going to turn around and say, well, actually, I'd like some more food, or my tray needs doing, or something, But yeah, weird, isn't it? Weird.
It is. I feel like I know people like that, though, who just make a continuous noise until you give them what you want. I think that's also some humans, to be fair. Yeah. Okay, right, everyone, we're going to start. So welcome back. For this section of the proceedings, I'm going to ask a few questions, and by the end of the process, if Kevin and I haven't answered your burning issues, you can also pop your own questions in the chat. So I'm going to start by saying that I wanted to create a space for deleted scenes as soon as I read the first poem. And I'm a huge fan, if that's not, insanely obvious, of Shirley Jackson, and also of the 1963 film The Haunting, which is based on her novel The Haunting of Hill House. One of the things that always impressed me about Jackson's work is that it is both a Gothic story and not a Gothic story. So Jackson's books, and The Haunting of Hill House in particular, deploy all the tropes, conventions, and formulas of the classic haunted house story, while also subverting them. So I love a good ghost story, which The Haunting definitely is, but maybe unlike the traditional ghost story, it isn't sort of fantastical or escapist. It doesn't take place in this kind of tightly contained fictional universe. There's no safety valve in Jackson's novel or in the film, because it's taking place absolutely in the real world, in a world that you know and recognize, in a world that's in many ways quite grotty and mundane. I think that Kevin's poems tap a similar space of that unresolved fear, that creeping unease, just sitting uncomfortably in the mundane world. So I wonder, Kevin, could you start by telling me something about what drew you to The Haunting, and about where you feel these poems fit in terms of maybe the Gothic or the horror genre?
Well, basically, I mean, what drew me to The Haunting initially was I'd reached the age of 22 and I still hadn't seen the film. And I went back to Blackpool for this mate of mine, Robert. It was his 21st party. It was just me and him, basically, a couple of other people. And we went back to this guy's flat, and The Haunting was coming on BBC 1 or 2 about 11:30 at night. So we sat and watched it. Never seen it before. And it impressed me because it was actually the first time round. It was actually quite a scary film. And what really impressed me about it was the fact that all the effects were created by suggestion. I mean, when you actually see that film, there's one special effect where there's something on the other side of the door, and the door is bending inwards like that. That's it. Apart from that, you hear thumping on the walls, and you can hear some muted dialogue coming through a wall. That's it. It's all built up using atmosphere. And I enjoyed it so much that I thought, I've got to read the book. And as it happened, my mother had a copy of the book that she'd read and finished with, which is right there. And she said, your mother she never read a book twice. She read hundreds of books, but she never read them twice. She always just read it and then put it on one side. So she gave me that and I read it. And the first time I read it, I think I read it in basically one sitting. And it just stayed with me. And I've seen the film, oh God, I don't know how many times. And the thing I like about both the film and the book is that, like a lot of really good ghost stories, it can be interpreted in one of two ways. Because in the book at one point, early on, Eleanor actually says, all these, because the house is all wrong. None of the corners are exact 45 degrees. They're all slightly off. The doors are all hung off center. The floors have all got a slight tilt. And she actually says, maybe it's and this is the novel, the accumulation of all this stuff is making people feel uneasy. That the whole thing could possibly be psychologically explained. And from there, I pondered it for years. And I mean, when you think about it, I first read the book when I was 22, and I didn't start writing the poems till I was about 60. So there was a long gestation period, you know what I mean? But I think the reason why I liked it also so much is because I've read hundreds of ghost stories. I mean, I've been addicted to them since I was a little kid. And I've lost count how many I've read. The vast majority I found disappointing. You know, so many of them seemed to be, and then I went back and the shop wasn't there. Or the fellow I was talking to at the bus stop, it turned out he'd been dead for 10 years or whatever. And what I loved about that was the fact that she'd written a novel that you could actually believe that could have actually happened. It rang true. And then what attracted me then, when I started thinking about it, was I noticed that there's actually two film versions. There's a colour remake, which is actually it's a kid's horror film, but I've seen it. And I noticed in that, Dr. Montague, as he is in the book, Dr. Marquay, as he is in the first film, and Dr. Merrow, as he is in the third film. And I began to ponder this idea that maybe what these were like, they were like folk tales. That, you know, when you get a folk tale, what happens is it's based on something that really happens. And then as it gets retold, it gets embellished and added to and added to and added to and added to. And I think where it fits in, I don't think it fits in with the usual Gothic novels at all, because I've read quite a lot of Gothic stuff. I mean, I've read the obvious ones like, you know, Dracula and Frankenstein. And I did actually plough through the Castle of Otranto once and wondered why the hell I'd subjected myself to it. You know, God. But that's about all I can give you. I think it's part of I think what Shirley Jackson did that was so brilliant was she took a genre which had largely become cliched and breathed brand new life into it. And I think that's the mark of a really good writer. I mean, it's like I like M.R. James ghost stories. Yeah. And there's one of his, Whistle and I'll Come to You. And he takes the oldest cliche in the world, which is the bedsheet ghost, and turns it into the stuff of nightmare. And of course, I remember the first time I read that, I was in the back room at my mum and dad's. There was a spare bed, and I read the book before I went to bed, and then I'm lying there with the moonlight coming through the thin curtains, looking at the bed next to me. You know, but that's the best answer I can give you, I'm afraid. Will that do?
That's a very good answer. And I'm really interested in what you say about the idea of the haunting story being like a folktale that's told in all these different ways and being kind of passed down across all of these different iterations. And maybe Shirley Jackson was just tapping into something itself that was older and had been there for much, much longer. And I'm really interested also in like the idea that your poems are sort of one version or one telling of that story. Like following on from the book and then the film and then the poems. And I've kind of like a slightly facetious question, I guess. It's like a slightly daft question. It's like, what will the next version be? How will that story be told next? Do you have a kind of sense of that? But I also sort of want to know, I guess, why poetry to tell your version of this story? What is it in particular about poetry as opposed to another medium?
Well, I think it's because poetry has always been my first love. I mean, when I started writing when I was in school, I had the good English teacher, you know, the one that every kid should have, the really good English teacher. This guy, he was a very brave man, because he came into a classroom full of 13-year-old lads and said, right, hands up, who doesn't like poetry? And we all sat there thinking, this is a trick question. You know, if you say you don't like it, you're going to end up having to learn, 200 verses or something or whatever. Because at that point, I'd gone from loving poetry in the junior school to hating it in the secondary school, because secondary school poetry was the Dragon Book of Verse. Open your books, we had this Irish Christian, well, open your books now, lads, page 17, how they brought the good news from Ghent to Aix. Right, McCann, read the first verse. So you'd read the first verse, right, buy heart for tomorrow, or it's the leather for you. So you'd take it home, you'd learn it. I'd get my mum to test me, my dad to test me, my sister to test me, the conductor on the tram, because it was that long ago, I went to school on a tram. The conductor on the tram even tested me. And then he'd make you stand up round the wall. And as he was going along, the nerves went and the strap came out, and inevitably you stumbled, so you got the strap. So I associated poetry with pain. Now, coming back to this guy, Turner, what he did was, he said, all right, don't answer. I'm going to read your poem now called "And Death Shall Have No Dominion" by Dylan Thomas. No questions, no essay, no comprehension. Just shut your eyes and listen and think of it as like a magic spell. And then he read it. And I had that moment where the hairs there on the back of my neck tingled, literally tingled. And then he started encouraging all of us to have a go at writing poetry, writing stories. He started a monthly school paper that I used to write for, but I always wrote poetry. And when I was about 16, there was a whole bunch of us who started writing poetry together. This was the 60s. So back then, if you weren't a rock musician, you were a poet. You know, if you wanted to, I mean, to be honest with you, one of the reasons why I wanted to write poetry was because I thought it might make me a bit more windswept and interesting for the convent girl. You know what I mean? Because I wasn't in a rock band, I was lousy at sports, and I couldn't afford a sports car, and I wasn't old enough to drive one anyway. So being a poet seemed to be the thing. But as I got more and more into it, I began to find that poetry became something that was more than just something I did. It became a complete passion. I mean, I noticed the other blokes that I wrote with when I was at school, they all fell away. There were people I met when I was at college that fell away, but it was always poetry. I didn't start writing short stories again until about 20 years ago. I spent the previous time writing nothing but poetry. So when I started this sequence, I am the one, the first poem, I am the one that turned back. I didn't decide to write it as a poem. It just, it was almost like it demanded to be written as a poem. I had this mentor, this fellow called Matt Simpson, who said to me, if you're writing a poem and it's not working, it's not coming together, it wants to be a short story. And if you're writing a short story and that's going nowhere, it wants to be a poem. And after that, after I'd written the first one, then I wrote Dudley. And then the other poems that came actually a couple of years later, those two poems lay fallow for about 2 years before the others arrived. It wasn't a conscious decision. It seemed to me to be the natural and logical thing to do. And I suppose also because in poetry, you can imply a hell of a lot using just a few words. I mean, I remember when I was about 13 or 14, this cousin of mine, Michael, bought me this Bob Dylan album, Another Side of Bob Dylan. There's a song on that called The Ballad of Hollis Brown. It's about this dirt farmer in South Dakota. He's got a wife and he's got 5 kids. They've got no money, starving, he's desperate. So finally, he shoots the kids, shoots his wife and kills himself out of sheer desperation. The last 2 lines of the song are, there's 7 shots ring out on a South Dakota farm, and somewhere in the distance, there's 7 new people born. 2 lines that says so much, that implies so much. And I think that's why I thought poetry, it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't a conscious decision, but I think that's why they came as poems, because poetry seemed to be, to me, to be the perfect form. So that's it.
That's a perfect answer, actually, I think. And I can see lots of people, lots of faces nodding along, and really that really resonates with all of us. That there
Kevin, who was it? Can I ask a question, Kevin? What was the name of the writer who said that if you're writing a poem and it's not quite coming together, then it wants to be a short story, or if it's a short story not quite coming together, it wants to be a poem. I want to give proper attribution to that line.
Oh, right. His name was Matt Simpson. He died a few years ago. Yeah, he published a lot. You might find him in the Blood Axe back catalogue if you want to work.
Awesome.
He was a good poet, and he taught me a huge amount. And that was one of the things he said to me about poetry. Was said, look, what prose does is it explains. What poetry does is it implies. Now that's not 100% obviously, because you can get like the Haunting of Hill House is prose, but I think there are quite a few moments where it aspires to the condition of poetry, just as poetry aspires, as Oscar Wilde said, aspires to the condition of music. But yeah, he was he had some good pithy comments about poetry. He taught me a hell of a lot, like I said. But yeah, Matt Simpson, MAAT.
Thank you, Kevin.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Kevin. I also wonder, I want to talk about something now, just sort of like, I have no elegant segue, so I'm just going to ask the question that I want to ask in a really kind of like obvious blurty out sort of way. Because I know we spoke before about something that struck me about the poems and Eleanor's voice in particular was just how authentic they felt. And I remember telling you that if I'd been given the poems cold, if I encountered them on the page, I would have assumed that a woman had wrote them. I couldn't quite, sort of like, I just can't quite get over that. I don't wonder if you have like a sense of how you achieve that voice, and what it was about the character of Eleanor that you identified with, or which kind of spoke to you.
I think what it was because when I was looking after Danielle's dad, and that was like, simplest way of explaining it, neither of us could leave this house unattended overnight. So Danielle and myself, what we had to do was split the week between us. And what I was doing was, when I was looking after him, you learn not to try to read a book. You never get involved in a TV program. You don't bother trying to read a book. You can't relax. When I was back here, I was here on my own. And to be quite honest with you, I did get a bit lonesome sometimes. And one evening, there was nothing on the telly. I had a bottle of wine, and I just thought, yeah, I think I'll get the Haunting out and reread that. And I reread it, and the poems started to come to me. The poems about Eleanor. And I think the reason why I was able to make her completely believable and make her voice authentic was because even though I'm a man and she was a woman, the one thing we had in common was we both knew exactly what it's like to be a carer, and how hard it is, and how it drains the life out of you. It's not just physically exhausting, it's emotionally exhausting, and it's, for want of a better way of putting it, it's spiritually exhausting as well. Yeah. And when you're looking after somebody with that condition, in a way, it is like being in a haunted house, because you sleep light. The slightest noise will wake you. You can't, and there's strange things happen. Like one morning, I accidentally overslept. I came downstairs. John, Danielle's dad, was in the living room trying to switch the telly on, and I walked in the kitchen, and he'd taken the kitchen chairs and put them in a circle, and got all the coats out of the cloakroom and put them in a pile in the middle of the circle, and then left it. And I was thinking, like, if that was a haunted house story, that would completely freak you out. You know what I mean? But it was that thing of being able to identify with the feelings, because whether you're male or female, despair is despair, hopelessness is hopelessness, and the desire for it to end, but the guilt that you feel because there is only one way it can end. It's not going to be. I remember me and Danielle talking about it one day, and saying, she turned around to me and said, "There's not going to be a happy ever after here, is there?" And I just went, "No, No, there isn't, kid. I said, I wish there was something I could say. I wish there was some comfort I could offer you, but there isn't. It will go on, and then one day it will finally stop. It was the same thing when my mum died. My brother, it was looking after most of the time. He said the same thing. So I could look at the situation from inside when I was being the carer. I could look at it from the outside, seeing what it was doing to Danielle. I could look at the outside and seeing what it was doing to my brother. And I think when I put all that together, that was how I think I managed to get that, achieve that voice. And also because I think when you're in a situation like that, I think this is what happened to, you know, as I call her, poor sad sweet Eleanor, that you're not quite sane. You can't be, because if you were sane, you know, I don't know. I can't find the right words. It's like there's a of all things, there's a great line in a comic book I read years ago called The Killing Joke by Alan Moore, where the Joker says, the world's a crazy place. Was it? If you didn't go mad, you have to go mad, because any other response would be insane. And that's what it felt like. And also what I wanted to try to do, I suppose, I wrote poems about being a carer as well. What I was trying to do was to find a way of getting across to people, if I possibly could, that this is what the word carer means. So it was exploring the Gothic and the haunted house and all the rest of it. But really, I think the thing I was most interested in was exploring Eleanor's character and seeing a 32-year-old woman whose life had been slowly but surely destroyed, had been just crushed out of her by circumstance. And in the end, I think when you're writing about a character, they become real to you. They have to become real in there. And I found quite a few times I'd be sitting on the bed at night thinking about it. You know.
Oh, thank you. There's a lot to think about. I can see we've got some questions in the chat as well. So Al has asked, speaking of Dylan, ... have you ever written music and song lyrics and things of that ilk?
Never written music because I can't read it. I was hopeless at music at school. When I was in, I mean, it's very quickly. When I was in the second year, when I was 12, we had this Christian brother came in and said, right, boys, you're all going to be learning a musical instrument for free for the next year. So it's telling me, what do you want to learn, McCann? Guitar, please, brother. Right, I'll put you down for the violin. I said, but what, guitar? And he said, it's got strings. And that was it. And we were at this school orchestra. And I always remember we had a concert in the summer term, and we all sat there making this cacophony, glaring at our parents who were all sitting there with these like stony faces trying to laugh, you know, because it was bloody. But I did have a go at writing a few song lyrics, but I never found any musicians who were interested in turning them into music. It's something I wanted to do because I was a big Dylan fan, huge Dylan fan. And I think I learned, you know, somebody said to me, I was in a school once and somebody said, who were the main poetic influences on you? And I listed a whole number of people. And then at the end I said, I'm Bob Dylan. Because, I mean, I do consider Dylan to be a poet. I know that's a very controversial thing to say, and I know it put a lot of people's backs up when he won the Nobel Prize. My view is all songs are poems. It's just that some songs are really, really bad poems. That's all it is. But I'm always on the lookout because I do like rhyme. I got into rhyme when I was writing for children. Once upon a time, about 8-9 years ago, lots of publishers were doing new anthologies for kids. They wanted new poems. And it'd be great. You get a letter saying, you've got 3 months. I want poems about dinosaurs. And we'll pay you 50 quid a poem. So you buy, I mean, I've got a rhyming dictionary. I'm shameless. I've got a very good rhyming dictionary. But I love rhyme. And also the way I taught myself rhythm was when I was 14 or 15. What I used to do was listen to a piece of music, a Beatles song, say, get the tune in me head, and then write my own words to that tune. That was how I started. This guy, Matt Simpson, I mentioned, he said when he was in school, he was in the church choir. So he said his first poems were all based on the rhythms of Anglican hymns. But that was, yeah. So, I mean, if there's any musicians out there ever fancy getting, I did get approached once years ago by a guy who said he wanted to turn one of my poems, he wanted to set it to music. And he did. and sent me the recording, and I just had to write back and say, no, because have you ever heard The War Requiem by Benjamin Britten? I watched the first 5 minutes of that once, and he takes this poem, Anthem for Doomed Youth by Wilfred Owen, and he's got the singer just going, who mourns for these who die like cattle? And it bloody ruined it, you know what I mean? And it was the same thing with this guy. What I would like is some of the kids' poems I think would make interesting songs, and the adult stuff that I've written that rhymes. I did write one poem where I called it me Dylan tribute, where I tried to get, it's only 3 verses, but I tried to get a rhythm that I could imagine music being added onto it. So yeah, there you go. There's a plea. If there's anybody out there who's a musician, whoever fancies working on something like that, I'm up for it. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't have to be cash involved. I just do it for the love. Because being a poet, I've been skint for 35 years, and once you get used to being skint, it's not that bad. You know, you appreciate. It's like, you know, one Saturday night, me and Danielle were sitting there, and we had 2 bottles of cheap wine, a Farm Foods pizza that she'd added extra cheese and garlic to, and a DVD that got out of the charity shop for 99p. And she turned around to me at one point and said, you know, money's wasted on the rich, isn't it? Because to them, this would be a really crap night, but for us, this is a brilliant Saturday, you know.
Yeah.
Sorry, I went off topic a bit there. I beg your pardon.
No, that's not off topic at all. That's, you know, that's, you know, kind of no ceasefire in the class war. That is literally always the topic. Whatever else is being discussed, that is the subtext and the text and everything else. Paul says, when we're writing a poem that's not quite coming together, it wants to be rock and roll, which made me laugh a lot. I want to ask, because you're talking about rhyme, and it's not on my kind of like list of pre-prepared questions at all, but I'm going to blast it at you anyway, because I've got this real thing that there is such, in UK like contemporary poetry publishing, there's such a lot of snobbery, I think, about rhyme. Like the old dudes, the old Faber and Faber dudes are allowed to do it, and it's considered a little bit cheeky and a little bit cool when they do it. But nobody else is allowed to write it. And if you try to sort of like send something off to like Poetry Magazine or Poetry London, you're sort of sneered out of the water. I mean, why do you think that is? I think is this something that you've experienced yourself with your own kind of like publication career? And it's, does it make you as angry as it makes me? Because it makes me furious.
Very right. I mean, I remember I used to go on a lot of residential courses. I mean, when I used to run classes for the university and things like that in writing, one of the things I said to the students was, you know, you're never too experienced to learn more. I mean, I always say with poetry, if you imagine that everything that there is to know about poetry stretched end to end would be about a mile, then in one lifetime, one poet, if they work really hard and study, etc., will get maybe about that much. Now, with rhyme, I don't know why there's this snobbery about it. I remember going on this residential course, and there was a well-known Blood Axe poet who shall remain nameless because he'd sue me probably. But in his introductory talk, this guy said, well, rhyme's useless. Nobody uses rhyme anymore. It's passé, it's old-fashioned, it's you know, he really slagged it off. So I thought, well, let him have his say, you know. And then I thought, right, I'll throw you. So, I'll, you know, hand up. Yes, Kevin, I said, don't you think that's a bit racist? And he went, me? I said, well, Afro-Caribbean poets use rhyme, and you're saying it's rubbish. And a lot of Irish traditional poets use rhyme. And Michael Longley used rhyme. Seamus Heaney used rhyme from time to time. And the one thing I always remember, when I was an English teacher for 16 years, and we were doing Wilfred Owen, the war poets. And there was one, he used echo rhyme, and I explained echo rhyme to them. And this one kid, Tim McAvoy, his name was, never forget him, he put his hand up, and I said, yeah, Tim, what? And he said, you know, you're saying like he uses half rhymes. I said, yeah. He said, does that mean he can't rhyme properly? And I explained, I said, like, he's trying to use a device, etc. But he said the same thing. He said, like, why don't poets use rhyme? Because to me, rhyming, if it's used well, can really add something. I mean, I've been reading a lot of stuff. I remember years ago writing to Poetry Island, asking them if I could get some information about like traditional Irish poetic forms. And And the woman who was running it at the time sent me a huge load of stuff she photocopied about, you know, Irish traditional poetry, internal rhyming, half rhymes, you know, having the last syllable of the third word and the second line rhyming with this first syllable of the fifth word. And so, you know, it's like a lot. And as I started exploring it, I found that rhyme in the right poem can add so much, especially if you don't draw attention to it. I mean, bad rhyming is bloody awful. I mean, I remember years ago going to an event in Wigan, and it was like a kind of antique roadshow for poets. And this woman came across, she had a big pile, and I knew she was eccentric because she had a hat on that looked like it had fruit all round it, you know. And she showed me these poems, and they all rhymed, but they made absolutely no sense at all. So I had to say to her, I said, like, I think you're being tyrannized by rhyme. You know, there's no real meaning there. I mean, after 15 minutes of arguing, I pointed to Matt Simpson. I said, see him over there. He knows everything. Go over to him and ask him, you know. But I went to a reading, an Irish poet who used a lot of rhyme. I think it was Tom Paulin. And when it's used properly, the great thing about rhyme is that when it's used properly, you're not consciously aware of it. It's there like it adds to the music somehow. If you can hear it coming, so it's like a jingle, you know, dum-de-dum-de-dum rhyme, dum-de-dum-de-dum rhyme. You're waiting for it to happen. You know what I mean? But what I like to do is I like to use full rhymes. I like to use half rhymes. I like to use echo rhymes. And I think if you are writing supernatural stuff, which I've done for kids, then I think rhyme really does add to it. So I don't get it. I don't understand why. I think the big thing that I've also got is because I read a lot of contemporary poetry anthologies, I'm beginning to notice how more and more poetry that I read in the mainstream stuff, for want of a better word, the capitalist media. It's like you read these different poets, and honestly, I can't, if there was no names underneath, I wouldn't know one from the other. It's like they're writing, you know, one guy actually said to me, oh, I use a template. And I said, oh, writing by numbers, you mean?
No. My God.
And I can remember going into a school, the best one, secondary school, and I said, getting the kids to write poems, and the teacher said, right, now, before you begin, plan your poem. And I went, no, you don't plan. Don't do that. Don't plan it. And then a kid in a junior school said, is it, he dropped his voice, said, is it all right if I put some rhymes in? And I went, yeah, why are you asking? He said, only Miss says we're not allowed to rhyme. And I don't understand why there's this dislike of it and this idea that somehow it's inferior. I mean, I know Milton once said that it was like it dragged poetry down. It was like the chains, etc. But you see, the other thing is, something I've discovered, is that if you're using a formal structure, there's a strange, beautiful thing with poetry. It's full of paradoxes, isn't it? Because if you're using a strict structure, somehow it seems to bring out a better poem. You know, it's like moving away from rhyme just for a second, like with haikus, you know, 575. I've written loads of 575s, but in the whole of my life, I've only managed to achieve one that I would call a genuine haiku, but I'm still trying. And the thing about rhyme as well is you've got to find the word that rhymes that carries the meaning as well. Something else that Matt Simpson said was, rhyme can help to uncover meaning. It's like, you know, that poem I mentioned earlier, me Bob Dylan one. Yeah. The last verse, it's about a fellow who goes in a bar and meets a bloke with tarot cards who gives him a reading. But the last verse, he says, he told me to stop fighting my mind's demented twin. He said to me, we're all afraid beneath these masks of skin. Now, when I wrote that, you know, when you have that, I bet you don't, about this something, I'm pointing to you with the screens if you can tell. But, you know, when that happens, I sat back and I mean, we're all adults here, there's no children, all that. And I just thought, fucking hell, where did that come from? Because I couldn't, and now the thing is, I couldn't have made that up in a million years. It would never have come to me. I was looking for a rhyme for twin. The first one was sin, and I thought, no, I'm not having that one. And then it just suddenly came to me. Now that's why I also like using rhyme and apparently restricted forms, because they can force things to the surface. You know, a lot of the time, people I've worked with in writers groups who write free verse, a lot of them suffer from what I call that'll do syndrome. You know, they write something and it seems good, so they go, that'll do. But if you're using a strict form, you can't do that. If it doesn't make sense, if the rhymes don't make sense and don't add to the meaning of the poem, then it's just somebody tinkling a bell, isn't it? It's nothing. But it can add so much. And I think the other thing about rhyme is it adds to the music, because it's like Basil Bunting said, you know, he said, when you write it, compose aloud. I read out loud when I've written something, because it's not just what it means that matters, it's what it sounds like. And the juxtaposition, two words, you pick the exact two words, and not only do they add to the meaning, but there's a subtle music underneath it all that's working, I think, on the reader's unconscious. And I think that's one of the things that draws people in as well. Well, that was all right.
That was fantastic. You held everybody.
You know, I'm loving this because it's been years since I've done this, and I'm absolutely bloody loving it. Anyway, carry on. I could go on. Don't worry, I won't. But I could go on all night.
Well, it may come to that.
No, sorry, you're right. There's 2 bottles of wine in the fridge downstairs. I've got my name on them, so I will pack in eventually. Anyway, go on, Fran. Next question, Fran.
Yeah, before you do, what I would really like is to open questions to the floor and see if anyone else would like to ask a question. Yeah, I was going to say put the questions in the chat, but you may as well just shout it out, because unless you really want to put it in the chat, of course.
Here, isn't there? Yeah.
Yeah. So if anybody has anything, everyone's got all shy now. Yeah,
people always. I once did a workshop for teachers, and when they came in, they thought I was going to give them a talk on poetry, and the first thing I did was give out. I said, right, you're all going to write a poem now. And it was amazing how many of them suddenly, astonishingly, I had a teacher, I haven't got a pen. This is a teacher of poetry. I haven't got a pen. I've left my glasses at home. I don't write poetry. I can't write poetry. It's hard.
The fear it inspires in people, it's quite, you sort of wish that you could harness that power in some way and concentrate it in yourself as a poet, but it doesn't seem to work. People are terrified of poetry, but they seem to treat you as sort of a level below contempt. That's been my experience.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, isn't it? The weird job description. What do you do? I'm a poet. Well, it's like, I was a road sweeper once when I was a student, and I was telling the kids about this when I was in school, and I said, the thing about road sweepers was, if it wasn't for road sweepers, you'd be up to your knees in crap in about a week or less. And it was the thing that struck me very hard at the time, is that when you're a poet, you're not better than other people, you're different. But the thing that I remember talking to another poet about this once, and I said to this guy, I said, the funny thing is, I said, if bin men went on strike, everybody had noticed within a week. But if poets go on strike, bugger even sees. That's one of the ironies about it, isn't it? And of course, it's that thing about England as well. The English love poets as long as they're good and dead, because that way
for at least 100 years
they can defang them, or they can airbrush them out. Like the myth that Siegfried Sassoon wasn't a very good war poet, even though he was a superb war poet. But he had a very left-wing point of view during the war years, so we don't want to talk about that. We'd rather talk about Wilfred Owen because he seemed nicer, more arsehole kind of thing. Anyway, go on, carry on. Question.
I actually see, Jack has his hand up. He has his digital hand up.
The thing that kept striking me, Kevin, is, in talking about rhyme, for example, what happens for me is those words do become rhythmic, musical in nature, just by their birth, basically. And that's a natural process. But there are stages of that process where, ultimately we're talking about something that's much, much more primal in that we're connected to the words, we're connected to the stories. We've got the rhythmic part of it that ties it into our bloodstreams, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you see it that way, because the way you kind of described it was the opposite. And I see it as more like our humanity is what draws us to those stories. It makes them important and valuable to us as individuals. And it's the humanity of it, and that rhythm tie is really our internal heartbeat or drum that's kind of driving our own lives.
Yeah,
And
that's what you mean.
so there's that desire that kind of comes from the words, or that anxiety, or that warmth or love, or whatever it might be that you feel. And I wonder if I'm picking up on something, or if I'm just, that's just a difference in the way that we might see it.
I'm not sure, to be honest with you, because the thing about me, when I'm talking about writing, I mean, a lot of poets do this. You get the impression that there's a lot of the time there's a conscious thought process going on while you're actually writing a poem. With me, I get these things occasionally. I get the thing that all poets want, which is the gift. The one that seems to come more or less fully formed. But even when they don't come fully formed, I found years ago that if I start consciously trying to think about it, somehow something goes. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question right here, but basically what happens with me with a poem is that once I'm involved in it, everything else in the world just seems to fade away. The poem itself becomes central to me thinking. I mean, I get depressions from time to time. And I remember quite a few years ago going to the doctor, and the doctor said to me, I'm going to give you antidepressants. And I said, no, you're not. I did that once before. What happens with antidepressants is you stop feeling depressed, but after a while, you stop feeling anything. You might as well be a zombie for all the difference it makes. I said, besides, I said, I've got access to the greatest antidepressant there is. And he went, what's that? And I said, poetry. Because when I'm writing, everything else just vanishes. So
and I think that what you're describing is a difference in process, really, more than anything else. And that's really the answer I'm looking for. Because the way that I write, I'm still working on poems that I've been working on for 12 or 15 years. That started off as a journal entry about an event that happened on that particular day. And, I've thought about it and rewritten it and, restudied it and learned lessons from it. And so the telling of that tale may have changed. And one of the things in that process is to chop out some words and let's make it a poem, and other things deserve to be longer and the story told as it is. And I think that's really, because it all ties back to my own personal humanity, my own personal experience. And I'm very selfish like that. I'm aware of that. And that's what we're talking about. It's a difference in your perspective versus what mine is. That's all. And that's exactly the answer I was seeking.
Oh, well, good. I'm glad. Because the thing is, I mean, I know what you're saying about going back to poems that you've written years previously. I do that. Well, I produced a book. Actually, I've got it here. I'm not plugging this. I just happens to be because I was looking it up. That was my last book.
It's great, by the way. Everyone should
nice cover, isn't it? Nice cover.
That's
great. But the thing with that was, I had a load of pamphlets out, and I was looking through them, and I suddenly realised I'd been very badly served by the editors, by the publishers, because they'd also suffered from that'll do syndrome. Part of it was because I discovered there's a scam that a lot of small publishers do, and what it briefly, it works like this: you set up a publishing house. You go to Arts Council England, you get a bucket load of money off them because you're going to publish 6 books of poems. So you publish 5 by other people and spend as little as possible on them and publish them as quick as you can. Then you spend the bulk of your money on your own. And for years I'd been, I was getting these pamphlets out. Not like I said, nobody was selling them, but at least I was being published. And then I sat down and got them all out and I reread them. And I was looking at various poems and thinking, that's almost there. That's almost there. How the hell did that ever get in? That's crap. That's bloody awful. That one's not me at all anymore. I think you know, it's a bit dubious, to be honest with you. I think there's a little touch of authoritarianism creeping in or whatever. And what I found was that when you go back to something years later, it's not a bad thing to do, because sometimes you distanced yourself from it, so you can now start to look at it objectively. The analogy I always use with being a teacher, ex-teacher, is like the parents' night thing, where you get somebody come in and they're talking to you about their son or their daughter, and you're telling them the things that you like about their kid, but you're also pointing out some of the things that are causing you worry or whatever. And the parents are so close to the kid, they can't see it. Do you understand what I mean? And it's the same thing when you've written a poem. You're so closely involved with it in the end. That's why I've got Danielle as my first reader. And the response I want from her, I know, I'm in my workroom upstairs right now. Next door is our bedroom. And we come up here in the afternoon and listen to music, keep the cat who lives up here company, because otherwise she gets a bit depressed, understandably. If I've written something new, I'll say to her, it's up on the screen. So she'll come through. Now she walks in with a big smile on her face and goes, oh yeah, then I know it's right. And if she comes in and goes, well, do you think you need that word in the second verse? And do you think that maybe the last verse you're explaining a bit? And it's that she's got the objectivity because she's not written it. But because I've just written it, I'm so close to it, sometimes I just can't see the faults anymore. And that idea of, you know, I've met poets who say, no, once it's finished, it's abandoned. I just discard it. It has to just stand as it is. Why? If you can take something that was halfway there and turn it from something that was okay into something that's actually quite good, why the hell shouldn't you? I don't think there's anything wrong with the idea of redrafting. I was thinking the big problem I had with a lot of my students at the university, the idea of redrafting seemed to drive them insane. You know, one guy said to me, like, how many drafts do you have to go through? And I said, well, as many as you need to. Yeah, but how many is that? I said, as many as you need to. And I got 2 poems, said, right, see this one? I said, that was 3. This one was 12. And the guy said, how did you keep going for 12? What we did? Because I said, because it took 12 drafts for me to know it was right. And that was all there was to it in the end. You have to be, I think if you're going to write poetry, you've got to be serious about it. Doesn't mean you've got to always write serious poetry, but you've got to be serious about it. One of the reasons why I stopped going to poetry readings in Liverpool was because I got absolutely fed up to the back teeth with listening to people who had obviously tried as stand-ups and fallen flat on their faces. So I thought, all right, I'll do poetry, it's easy. Or the people who think that poetry is some kind of dodge, that, you know, it's simple. And it's not, is it? It's, if you're going to get it right, it's a lifetime of hard work and study and reading, and it's worth every bloody minute of it. Because one of the things that I've discovered, and years ago, is that I love redrafting. I mean, I really love it. If something goes to 10 or 11 drafts, I'm in heaven. And the closest thing I've ever come to it in something that wasn't poetry was when I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which if you've never read it, give yourself a treat. It's a brilliant book. But the guy in there is talking about stripping down his motorcycle engine and laying out all the pieces and cleaning them and then putting it back together again and then switching it on and it running and it's smooth because everything's working beautifully together. Well, that's how I feel about it. It's like redrafting is almost like micro-engineering. Remember, there's a great poem by Miroslav Holub, and I can't remember the whole thing, but it's about these kids that go to a fairground and there's a merry-go-round going round. And all the other kids are looking at the merry-go-round. And there's one kid on his knees looking at the mechanism underneath. And the kid's looking at the mechanism and he thinks to himself, that motor is smooth as shit. And the last line of the poem was, and that boy will be a poet. And that's why I love it. That's why I love it so much. And yeah, it is a great, and I met Miroslav Holub. I was lucky enough to meet him years ago, a few years before he died. And he was a wonderful poet, really, and a really wonderful man. And I was asking him I said, how long do you work on a poem? And he said, well, as long as it takes. And I said, why do you write them like that in that long, thin, spare style? He said, because I'm an immunologist. So what I do is, while I'm waiting for something to grow in a petri dish, I've just got to stand there staring at it. He said, I can't do anything else. He said, so I compose in there. And honestly, every poet I've ever met who I've respected and liked, and in some cases literally loved, that's the one thing I've noticed that they've all got in common. You talk to them about redrafting and they all say the same thing. And I think that's the difference between the person who wants to be a poet and the poetaster. The poetaster rattles something out that'll do, because they're not interested in poetry. They're interested in impressing other people. Whereas the poet wants to write the great poetry. I started off by wanting to impress other people. I mean, when I was telling somebody, when I was an adolescent, when I was a teenager, when I first started writing, all of my poems were all addressed to girls. And they were either, I adore you, why won't you go out with me? Or, would you go and finish with me for? I'm sensitive, you'll be sorry about that one of these fine days. But then gradually, that bullshit fell to one side. And I started to want to write about other things that mattered to me. I wrote about the Vietnam War, they were lousy poems, but I wanted to write about that because it was going on at the time. And I'd seen a book in the library called Vietnam by Felix Green, Graham Greene's brother, that told the truth about what was happening in the Vietnam War. And suddenly I was desperately wanted to write about that. I wanted to write about things that mattered. And, fancying some girl who didn't want to know me, that seems somehow all of a sudden like, yeah, it's annoying, but it's trivial, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? Anyway,
yeah,
so
absolutely. No, that's fantastic. Kevin, I think we're going to have to call it a night, but that was amazing poetry. Yeah, amazing poetry and amazing discussion. And I hope that, come back and do another one of these readings for Culture Matters, and that we can all maybe read together again another time.
I'd love to. And I mean, to be honest with you, I've enjoyed the conversation. I mean, I know I've done most of the talking tonight, but, I don't want to sound egotistical, but it was about me,
It was good.
What would be great, what would be great would be to meet together from time to time and talk about poetry and why we all love it and why we all think it's important and how we can make more, not sound like force, but how we can induce more people to like it. I think a lot of people are frightened of poetry, and there's no need to be. I'll tell you one last thing before we go. I was years ago when I was a teacher, we got Macbeth as the O-level play. And there was a set of books in the book room called Shakespeare Made Easy. And it was parallel text. One half was in plain English, the other half was in blank verse. So I read the plain English one with them first so they could know what was going on, what the story was. Then I read the blank verse one. And at the end of it, now this is a class of 15-year-old Scouts kids. I said, all right, which one did you prefer? And this one lad, I think it was Tim McAvoy again, he said, I like the proper Shakespeare, sir. And I said, why did you like that? And he said, I just loved the sound of it. I loved the way it sounded. And that, to me, that was it. Because poetry is magic. It really is. But I better let you all go.
Oh, Kevin, thank you.
I'm gagging for a drink myself.
Kevin.
Yeah, and thank you. And I have had a look at the comments that have come on the chat screen. Really nice. Thank you so much for all your kind words and your support. It makes a massive difference. As Mr. Spock would say, live long and prosper, all of you, and let's meet again sometime.
Definitely, for sure.
And one of these days, face to face, and a few scoops, a few drinks, just to lubricate the conversation.
Absolutely. Good night, everybody. Take care. Thank you for coming.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you, Franny. Thank you, Jack and Franny and Kevin.
Thank you again.
Hell of a show.
I'm
Hey,
glad you
Fran,
liked it.
I'll let the stream run out and upload, and then I'll see what I can do with it and get it online somewhere as soon as I possibly can. Let everybody know at that point.
Do that.
And I'm coming for you, Kevin. We got things to talk about, my friend. Let's build that place.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, you look after yourself, and good night to you. I'm going to go now.
Good night, everybody.